Okay, so in our last segment, we looked at a definition of attitudes and also how attitudes are formed, the source of attitudes, right? Now we're going to pick up here with measuring attitudes. So how would we measure attitudes? Obviously, if I want to know how you feel about something, the easiest and most direct way to find out is to ask you, right? Many attitude measures are self-report measures, and they do just that. However, sometimes people would not be willing to honestly report their feelings. For instance, if I asked about the racist feelings, in fact, they may not be able to report them, right? Do you think someone could be racist without even knowing it? Absolutely. In cases like these, some researchers add something interesting called a bogus pipeline when administering their self-report measures. They allegedly hook participants up to brain scans or other forms of supposed lie detectors during the answering process. Allegedly, meaning they aren't really, but participants think so, so it tends to induce more honest answers. Covert measures are especially useful for capturing attitudes of which people are unwilling or unable to report. Researchers can choose from a number of covert measures. Perhaps the most straightforward of these is measuring observable behavior. For instance, measuring racist attitudes by counting how many seats a participant chooses to sit away from a person of another race. A second covert measure would be facial EMGs, that's electromyographs, right? They measure muscles. They are a way to measure facial expressions, such as the degree to which someone expresses pleasant feelings in their facial muscles, for instance, smiling, or unpleasant ones, for instance, frowning. Other brain scans are now being explored to identify arousal, such as the functional MRI. However, positive and negative arousal can be tricky to distinguish from each other. So these types of measures are more in an exploratory stage at the present time. Perhaps the most used covert measure is the IAT. That is short for the Implicit Associations Test. It is a kind of cool test because it can measure how connected certain thoughts are to each other in your head. Imagine that you are a participant and you are told that your job is simply to press the space bar when you read a word. Words flash across the screen one at a time, and you hit the space bar each time you read one. Now imagine that your response time is measured in milliseconds, minute milliseconds. And the word cat comes on the screen and you respond. In which case do you think you'd respond fastest if the next word was dog or jug? As you probably guessed, participants tend to respond to dog faster because the words dog and cat are associated in their minds. You might say they are closer to each other in their neural networks, so it is quicker to mentally jump from cat to dog than from cat to jug. Thus, the IAT can measure implicit associations. Remember, the ones we are not even aware that we hold? In this same way. For instance, it can measure how fast one responds to the word aggressive after black faces compared to white faces. Now, what good is measuring attitudes if they don't predict behavior, right? Think about it. An attitude measure is only helpful if it helps us to predict how high scorers will behave differently than low scorers. How can we use attitudes to predict behavior? Back in the 1930s, long before you and even I were born, a social psychologist, Richard Lapierre, did a classic study we're going to call the Chinese service study. He took a well-dressed, middle-class Chinese couple around the country visiting 250 service establishments, such as restaurants and hotels. Even though prejudice against Asians was widespread at that time, they were only refused at one place. Richard then wrote the establishments asking if they would serve Chinese patrons. Only a few said yes. This doesn't sound promising as far as attitudes predicting behavior, right? So what's up here? Is there no link between attitudes and behavior? As you might have guessed, there are a number of possible explanations why Richard did not find a link. The couple was well dressed and middle class, for instance. The couple was accompanied by a Caucasian. The person answering the phone often may not even have been the same person who provided service. Social norms of politeness or dollar signs may have actually overridden prejudice attitudes when push came to shove, etc. But this study set the stage for studying how we can use attitudes to predict behavior. Clearly, other factors come into play that must also be measured. Eisen's theory of planned behavior outlines these factors. Okay, so here we are. Eisen's theory of planned behavior. First, we need to measure the attitude towards a specific behavior. So in LaPierre's study, asking the person on the phone, would you serve a middle-class, well-dressed Chinese couple accompanied by a Caucasian man, right? And if we want to know more general attitudes, we have to measure attitudes toward a lot of specific behaviors, right? We need to capture as many slices of that pie as possible. Next, notice here, we must know the subjective norms, what the person perceives to be the social norms in that environment. Yes, prejudice was widespread, but how common were hotel owners actually refusing service then right to a client's face? Finally, we must know to what extent the person believes he or she has control over the behavior. In LaPierre's case, asking, will you be there handling these decisions with that authority at the time? Now, if these three produce strong enough attention, attitude can serve as a great predictor of behavior. Eisen's theory of planned behavior.